Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andy Hirneisen, and I'm a food safety educator with Penn State Extension based in Berks County. Today, we're going to make homemade dill pickles. And the first thing we want to do whenever we do anything in the kitchen is wash our hands. So we make our hands wet, we add soap, and then we scrub. And we scrub for about 20 seconds. So we don't just want to do the inside of our hands. We want to get around our fingernails, between our fingers, the backs of our hands, around our thumbs, up to the top of our wrist, to make sure that we're removing any contamination from our hands so we don't spread it around and pass that contamination through the rest of the food in our kitchen. I'm going to dry my hands with a paper towel instead of a shared towel that everybody's been using. And then I'm going to use the paper towel to turn off the water. So we're making dill pickles. So pickles start out with cucumbers. So when we're making pickles at home, we want to choose cucumbers that are on the smaller side, about 4 inches or so. However, when you go to the farm stand, they may not have exactly what you were looking for. Whenever you get your pickles, you want to cut off about 1/16 of an inch. So just a little slice off of the blossom end. And you can tell it's opposite of the stem. And if you're not sure, it's okay if you cut off both ends. So just a little sliver. And the reason for that is there are some enzymes. And enzymes are like little chemical scissors that cause food to break down. There are some enzymes in that blossom end that can cause the cucumber to get soft. And that can be a reason why you have soft pickles if you don't cut off that blossom end. I also want to look through, because these are pickles that are coming maybe directly from the farm, they might have some damaged ends, or I don't even know what this is. It's just something funky and brown. I'm going to cut that off. I don't want that in my pickles. So the first step is to soak our pickles in a solution of water and pickling salt. Canning and pickling salt is just plain sodium chloride. It does not have any additives in it. It doesn't have any minerals or anti-caking agents. So it's not going to cause any cloudiness or discolorization in our canned food. And if we would see food that is cloudy or discolored, it might make us wonder if that's been spoiled. However, because it doesn't have anti-caking agents in it, I like to put the box in a bag so that I don't get moisture and I don't get one big clump of salt. The reason we do this is it helps to plump the pickles. Just like if you would brine a turkey, it helps make it more moist. It gets the moisture and gets them hydrated. So that's what I've done here. Now, I mentioned earlier that ideally we have pickles that are around 4 inches. This is a little bigger, but this is the only pickles that they had when I went to the farm stand. So if I was to put this in a pint jar, it's not going to fit. So I'm going to have to make some trimmings of that. Before I do that, make myself some room. I'm just going to drain off that salt water. So let's trim the rest of those pickles, and you can kind of use a jar as your guide if you want to leave them whole. If you would like to slice the pickles, you can also do that. Depending on how you're going to use them, that's okay. Now, don't throw away the little scraps that we're that we're cutting off to the side. What you could do is make a jar of all your scraps, and there's nothing wrong with them. They're just not as big. You could also just make them into refrigerator pickles. And refrigerator pickles don't go through the canning process. They just use the same brine or any brine of your choice and go in the refrigerator. Now, if we are canning our pickles, like I'm going to do today, then we want to make sure that we are following a recipe that was specifically designed for canning. Because pickles, or I should take a step back and say cucumbers, are a low acid food. And when it comes to canning food, we divide foods into two categories, if they're high in acid or low in acid. And that determines how we process them or cook them inside of the jar. If it's something that's low in acid, we need to use a pressure canner. If it's something that's high in acid, we use a boiling water bath canner that I'll talk about in just a little bit. But cucumbers are low in acid. We have to add the correct amount of acid when we're making our brine so that they're safe to sit at room temperature. Does anybody know what bacteria we're concerned about when we're making home canned food? Okay, so some people said botulism. So the bacteria is called Clostridium botulinum, which causes botulism toxin. And it's a very strong, can be deadly poison that's produced by that bacteria that grows in a warm, moist environment at room temperature. So just like we've got on the inside of a jar of home canned food. So these are some pickles that I made a few weeks ago. The reason I made them a few weeks ago is it takes a little bit of time for the brine to fully soak into the pickles and have a fully developed flavor. These are totally safe to sit at room temperature because I followed a recipe that was tested in a laboratory to ensure safety. The Penn State Extension series of handouts called Let's Preserve are all research tested recipes. They've been tested in a laboratory to make sure that they're safe. We want to stay away from recipes that we find on the internet or cooking blogs or even cookbooks that you find around. If we don't know what source it comes from, we assume that it's unsafe. When you're canning food, that is not the time to be creative because you can accidentally end up killing your friends and family. We don't want to do that. So, following that recipe, I've made a brine solution. And a brine is just simply the liquid that's going to surround the pickles in the jar. This has vinegar and water and some sugar, some salt, and I use the canning salt, and some pickling spice. Pickling spice is a mixture of different spices that once you taste it or you smell it, it smells familiar and you've had that flavor before. But we don't want those spices to be floating around in the jars. I've tied them up in some cheesecloth and I just clipped it to the side of the pot so it's easy to pull out later. You can also use, if you have some disposable tea bags, like if you buy loose tea, you can put it in there. You do want to make sure that whatever you do is food grade. So you wouldn't want to take a rubber band, for example, because rubber bands are not meant to be eaten. So we wouldn't want to cook that in the pot with our food. So this brine just needs to come up to a boil, and we're kind of making tea with those spices. The flavor is going to get into the water. So we prepared our brine, we prepared our cucumbers. Let me talk about the jars. Canning jars may be reused as long as you check to make sure that they're not chipped or cracked on the top. However, the lids that go on the jars are only designed to be used one time. There's this orange sealing compound on the bottom that heats up when the jars go in the canner. When the jars come out of the canner and everything contracts and cools down, that's what sucks the lid onto the top of the jar. If we reused this sealing compound, there would already be an indentation in there, and it would be less likely that we get a strong seal. You don't want to go to all that trouble and all this work just to have your jars come unsealed. The last piece of the jar is the ring that holds the lid on. That may be reused as long as it's not rusty. The jars that I have on the back burner are heating up in some water. So the pot has a rack in the bottom. We want that rack so that the jars aren't sitting directly on the bottom, because as the water boils, they'll kind of dance around, and we want the water, the hot water, to completely circulate around the jars. You can make your own canner like I did here. This is just the pot that I cook spaghetti in, or you can purchase a canner that's already set up for that. However, those tend to be really large. And if you've got a glass top stove, that weight can be too much for your stove. Technically, you want to double check with your stove manufacturer and see what they recommend for canning. But I have a glass top stove. I use this smaller canner and then can in smaller batches so I don't have to worry about the weight. So this water right now, I just want to be simmering. Now, for when we're canning products, some people ask, well, do you have to sterilize your jars? Meaning boil your jars empty. And the answer is, it depends. It depends on your research-tested recipe. For products that process less than 5 minutes, and there are some pickle products that process less than 5 minutes, then we do need to sterilize our jars just by boiling them empty for 10 minutes. For these pickles, for pint jars, which I'm using today, they process for 10 minutes, usually. However, here outside of State College, if you check our elevation is over 1,000 feet. And the temperature of water changes, temperature that water boils at changes with elevation. So we have to adjust for that. So we're going to process for 15 minutes. Because it's processing for 15 minutes, the jars just need to be clean, and I'm heating them up to get them started. So I'm going to take my brine and just set it to the side so that I can transfer the canner up to the front burner so we can all see what's going on. So I've got my jars preheated. I've got my brine ready to go, have my pickles ready to go. We're going to start filling the jars. I'm just going to remove one jar at a time, and I'm going to pour the water back into the canner because I'll need that water to cover the jars. We want the jars to be covered by 1 to 2 inches of water so that I don't forget, because usually half my jars have it and half my jars don't. I'm adding 1/8 of a teaspoon of a product called Pickle Crisp. It's calcium chloride. And all this does is help to make the pickles get more crunchy. There's some other products out there that you might have heard of before. Pickling lime is one of them. That is an old-fashioned method that people used to use. However, that can be dangerous because it lowers the level of acid in the food. You have to rinse it away a lot. Don't worry about that. Use good quality pickles, use Pickle Crisp, and you'll be okay. Also adding some mustard seed and some dill seed. You can also use fresh dill flowers if you have them. They get measured directly into each jar. Now I'm going to take my pickles and add them to the jar. We'll see how many I can fit. We do want them to be firm, but not so firm that I'm pounding them in. They will shrink a little bit. So these 4 fit perfectly inside the jar. The next thing I'm going to do is ladle some of our brine over the top. And I'm looking for 1/2 an inch of head space. That's the blank area in the top of the jar. We can use a jar measurer tool. This has little notches. Each one is 1/4 of an inch. And the other side is nice for just making sure there's no air bubbles trapped in those nooks and crannies between the pickles. I do not want to use a metal butter knife for this because that can etch and scratch. So I'm looking for 1/2 an inch of headspace. I hit it right on. I don't always do that. If it's a little over or a little under, you could just scoop. Oh, I just saw an air bubble. Let me double check. Okay, I'm still good. You can just scoop out a little bit if you need to. So I'm taking a damp paper towel and just wiping off the top rim. I'm going to add my lid and then screw on the screw band, but just fingertip tight. I don't want to screw it super tight. That's a common mistake that people make when canning food at home. They think that they want to tighten that jar really tightly because they think it's going to get their seal to form better. And this is good logic, but it doesn't work. When the food is heating up in the jar, it expands. And as it expands, all of the steam is escaping from that headspace, that blank area in the top of the jar. If we put the lid on really tight and trap all that air in the jar, we're not going to get a good vacuum seal to form. A vacuum is the absence of matter. It means there's nothing there. When the jar is removed from the canner and cools down, that's what contracts and creates that suction on the lid and gets the lid to close. So if we had that air trapped in there, we would not get a good seal. So just fingertip tight, and that is as far as we want to go. I'm just removing one jar at a time from the canner because we want the jars to stay hot. If we got all the jars out and filled them all and put them back in together, that would allow them to cool down. So one jar at a time. Now, having the spices pre-measured out helps things go along as well, keep things moving fast. When you're making a batch, you can just make a half a batch if that's the amount of cucumbers that you have or the size that would fit in your canner. Just make sure you're double checking your math correctly when you make your brine so that you have that proper concentration. Because like I said, if we would accidentally put in the full amount of water, but only half the amount of vinegar, that could result in this product being unsafe. One more thing to mention, the first 3 jars that I filled were wide mouth jars. A pint, this is just a standard pint jar. The wide mouth are easier to fill because they have a wide mouth, but either is fine. You could also do quart jars. That's what I did earlier. Just double check the chart at the back of the recipe that tells you, did I add pickle crisp to this? Oh, so half of you said yes, half of you said no. Okay, I see it. It's in the bottom there. I told you about half of them I forget to put in. Double check, though, if you are doing a quart jar, check the recipe to make sure that you have it in for the proper amount of time. Quart jars could be usually a longer process time. So after I add my last jar, I'm going to turn the heat on my canner up to high. I'm going to replace the lid. And when it comes to a full rolling boil, then I will start a timer. I want to confirm that I've got 1 to 2 inches above the water in the jar, in the canner, which I do. So I'm going to replace the lid, let this come to a full rolling boil. We checked the chart, 15 minutes, this will need to boil. At the end of 15 minutes, I'm going to turn the heat off and remove the lid and let the jar sit in the canner and cool down for 5 more minutes. If we take the jars out immediately, we can experience siphoning, and that's when the liquid starts to come out of the jar before the vacuum seal starts. Some people will call and say, you know, it was full when I started, but now there's like half the liquid is gone. Cooling too fast could be a reason for that. At the end of those 5-minute cool down, I'm going to remove each jar and set it onto a protected surface like this hot pad, a cutting board, a towel. I'm going to leave a few inches in between them and let them cool undisturbed for 12 to 24 hours. Don't be tempted to poke at the top of your jar before that. It's like a baby chick. It has to do it on its own for it to count. If you push it down and it hasn't had time to seal on its own, that doesn't count as a sealed jar. It needs to go in the refrigerator and you eat that one first. Otherwise, at the end of 12 to 24 hours, you can push on the top of the jar to see if the lid is down. You can also just look to see if it's down. You can tap on it with a spoon, and they sound different, sealed versus unsealed. You remove the ring band and wash underneath. If there's any pickling spices or any residue that got stuck in there, that can encourage mold growth, which can eat away at the seal. And if there's water in there, that can encourage rust, and that can eat away at the seal. And even though we followed a tested recipe, we've measured exactly, we followed the directions exactly, if anything funny happens in the jar, we want to know about it, right? So we want that lid to come off. Another way to check your seal is you should be able to lift the jar just by the lid. It should be that strong to hold that. You want to label so you remember what kind of pickle it is and when you made it, because you want to eat that in a year for the best quality, and just store it in a cool, dry, dark place, and you'll be good to go for a whole another year.